Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. This is our second National Science Foundation Navigating the New Arctic Community event hosted by the Navigating the New Arctic Community Office. My name is Noor Johnson. I'm a research scientist at the National Snow and Ice Data Center at the University of Colorado Boulder, and I'm the social science lead for the Navigating the New Arctic Community Office. Today, we're going to be discussing plans for returning to and initiating field research during the COVID-19 era. This event follows closely behind an event we held last Thursday that focused on COVID-19 pandemic guidance for researchers planning fieldwork this summer. For those who missed it, the recording and slides from that event are available on the Navigating the New Arctic Community Office website, and we'll be putting a link to that in chat. Please note that we are recording today's event in plenary. We'll be breaking into small discussion groups later in the session. We will not be recording those discussions. Before we get started, I will turn it over to my colleague, James Temte, to give a land acknowledgement.
Good morning. My name's James Temte. I'm a member of the Northern Cheyenne Tribe and director of the Alaska Pacific University Office of Research and Community Engagement and co-PI on the Navigating the New Arctic Community Office project. I would like to acknowledge all the Indigenous land across the Arctic. We are grateful for their past and present stewardship of the waters, plants, animals, and spiritual practices of this sacred place. I am joining you from the traditional homelands of the Dena'ina in Alaska's largest village, currently known as Anchorage. I'd like to acknowledge, now I'd like to turn it over to NNA Community Office Convergent Research Lead, Twila Moon, to briefly introduce the office and our team.
Hi, welcome everyone, and thank you, James. I'll give a brief introduction to the NNA Community Office, which, as you may know, was established this February. And the Navigating the New Arctic, or NNA, is one of NSF's 10 big ideas, and as such is supporting research projects that address challenges in the rapidly changing Arctic using a convergence research approach. So in other words, use-inspired, highly collaborative research that draws on information and expertise from across disciplines and knowledge systems to solve complex challenges. The Navigating the New Arctic Community Office fulfills part of this NSF mission by building awareness, partnerships, opportunities, and resources for collaboration and equitable knowledge generation within, between, and beyond the research projects funded by the NNA initiative. The NNA Community Office is a distributed office across 3 locations. You could already get a sense of that at Alaska Pacific University, the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and the University of Colorado Boulder. We're actively working to support and uplift efforts underway within the NNA community, which entails investigators, Arctic community members, Indigenous knowledge holders, educators, decision makers, international partners, and more. There are many members of the NNA community and people who we hope will join the NNA community. We'll also be developing community events, listening sessions, workshops, and trainings to support the wide variety of interests and needs of the NNA community. This event is part of a series that we'll be developing over the years ahead using an approach informed by the NNA community, our key partners, our Indigenous and research advisory boards, and the NSF NNA working group. Next slide there, our approach and planning will be structured along several strategic objectives. These include co-production of knowledge, convergence research, both there on the top, education and outreach, and open science, you can see there. And they're anchored by our core objective of communication, coordination, and learning. You can also find more details about what we have planned within these strategic objectives on our website. And you can, even the last link in the chat will still take you to our website. Our approach is also informed by a set of guiding principles that will look to orient our engagement and remind us of the unique priorities and values that need to be upheld within Arctic research. These also are available on our website. And our final slide is to give faces to the names of those in our NNA Community Office leadership team. Most of us at this meeting, many of us are at this meeting today, and we look forward to working with you in the coming years to support your research and education and outreach goals. Last, before I hand it back over to Noor, I want to acknowledge the NNA Community Office support from and close collaboration and cooperation with the National Science Foundation and the NSF NNA Working Group. We're really grateful to those from NSF who have been able to join us today. So hopefully you'll visit the website and continue to familiarize yourself with the office and what we can do for you. And I'll pass it back over.
Thank you, Twila. Today, we will have a series of short presentations from our panelists, followed by some time for questions and answers, followed by a time to break into smaller discussion groups to connect and learn from one another. We ask everyone to please keep your microphones muted, and if you have questions during the presentations, feel free to type them in the chat and we will moderate the questions during the Q&A session. I will now briefly introduce our panel and then ask each panelist to please introduce yourself and give a short perspective. So we're joined today by Andrey Petrov from the International Arctic Social Sciences Association, who will share perspectives from a piece that was recently published in Nature, Building Resilient Arctic Science Amid the COVID-19 Pandemic. And we're putting a link to that piece in chat in case you didn't get it in the email that we sent out. Shari Fox is joining us from the National Snow and Ice Data Center. Shari will bring a perspective from her work in Nunavut, Canada. Roza Laptander from the University of Hamburg will share a perspective from Lapland and from Western Russia. And Sveta Yamin-Pasternak from the University of Alaska Fairbanks will share a perspective from her work in Alaska that draws on an approach called patchwork ethnography. So to begin our discussion, I invite Andrey to introduce himself and share some initial comments.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Noor. It's an honor to be invited, I guess, and talk about this piece. But first of all, I just want to acknowledge that I'm reporting to you from the traditional and ancestral lands of Meskwaki and 14 other nations in Iowa who cherished and preserved this land for us, that we can enjoy it right now. In my presentation, I just go over some of the things that were in that piece that Noor just referred to, and hopefully we'll have an interesting discussion. So, and again, first of all, I also want to acknowledge my co-authors on that piece, although it's not just from that piece, but still there's, of course, co-written by Yaskan, a UArctic president, alongside with myself, and other co-authors that contributed as well. So it's not just me who came up with all that. So I think it's important to remember. So I guess I was asked to talk about the impacts of COVID on Arctic science, and really the idea behind writing something about it was how do we build, how we improve our science enterprise in the Arctic based on what COVID-19 revealed and what opportunities and issues it presented. Well, first of all, I'll just remind you that the COVID-19 pandemic in the Arctic is continuing. About 500,000 Arctic residents have been infected so far. About 10,000 died since the beginning, which was February 2020. So it is a really important event that really taken toll on all communities across all Arctic jurisdictions, and we really need to make sure that we work diligently to address the immediate and long-term consequences. But my focus today is more on impacts on Arctic science. So what has COVID pandemic revealed, what it indicated, and maybe what wounds it reopened in some ways and what new perspectives it outlines. So first of all, of course, Arctic research has always faced logistical cost and access challenges. It's not the question of pandemic years, it's just the reality, right? During pandemic, of course, as we all know, research close and away from communities was all canceled, trimmed, and postponed. We faced major disruptions in travel, field work, existing connections were kind of put in question because we couldn't visit our friends, colleagues, and partners. So it's really kind of a lot of disruptions has happened over that 13 months now, 14 months now, right? It is interesting that most of what we do, a lot of what we do kind of virtualize. So we kind of on the path of sort of virtual science, which is sort of in some ways new page, and on the other hand, maybe it's sort of following some trend that already been there. And of course, we need to make sure that we understand that even though we may not be practicing science in the communities right now, but there is a lot of impacts that come from both the pandemic itself, but also from the lack of support and funding and other things that science brings to communities. And that has been a considerable impact on operators and our partners who are in the Arctic and who live and work in those communities. So in some ways, the two words that come to my mind when I talk about or think about impacts is kind of virtualization, localization. So on one hand, we have this virtualized science and research enterprise. And on the other hand, we really understood that local is very important for any continuation of our science work. So if we would like it to continue, we really need to invest in local. So it's interesting just for a second to think about these two trends, which could be divergent or could at some point be working together. They do remove some, but create new inequities, right? I mean, they in some ways reopen opportunities for many others to participate in meetings like that. At the same time, they exacerbated old and created new inequities, for example, in respect to connectivity or whose voices are being heard and when and how. Of course, potentially, some of this process could serve to stimulate further decolonizing process in science, which I think is the main process that we would like to promote and to use this opportunity to advance. But some of them are really not very helpful in that. We all faced capacity constraints, and it's actually locally, of course, a lot of local capacity constraints with quarantines and ways that people couldn't go with their lives the way they wanted. But also for us, and the virtual side, when our living rooms turn into offices and all these other things. So it's very important to keep in mind as well. Of course, the COVID made difficult training students and educator scholars. On the other hand, it stimulated citizen science that kind of became more important, more articulated, what it could do in conjunction with other types of exercising science. And of course, co-production is very important for this office. Some process really promoted it and some impeded, right? So our necessity and opportunities here, have kind of divergent trends. So these are kind of these two main consequences, I think, that we really need to reflect on. I mean, we all know responses that we have had, right? It's ad hoc adjustments like Mosaic, it's engagement or re-engagement of indigenous knowledge to fight the pandemic itself, or its consequences, such as building new networks among indigenous communities, or working with indigenous communities and health professionals to address pandemics. But really, what is probably important to emphasize that we have an opportunity for rethinking, because this pause that we talk about is really an opportunity to forge in new relations. For the scientist or the science enterprise, it's a question of who, how, and what we do in the Arctic. What kind of science is being exercised? What are priorities? What are objectives? Who should be the ones who define them? And for communities themselves to think what or whether research is actually welcome on their lands. So that's, I think, this pause has given us this chance to think about it. And what we thought to emphasize are the following few things. Well, of course, as we built a new science enterprise based on what happened now, we really need to look into several directions to make it more resilient based on the consequence of COVID pandemic. Of course, we don't do harm now, right? I mean, making sure that no infections or any other ways that that communities could be affected is implemented. But longer term, we really need to prepare for embracing a local turn, which means that we invest in permanent presence of science in the Arctic, and field station, community observation system, local colleges, and community experts to reduce the need for outside experts. And that's important because that's really builds the foundation of the science, no matter what circumstances or crises arise. The time to support broader localized science infrastructure network in the Arctic itself, and rely on local partnerships that are based on equity, trust, and respect with indigenous communities and all communities in the Arctic. So this all assumes investing and rechannelizing resources for local capacity building, along with funding community members to conduct collaborative or their own research. That's also very important. So really, we need to rethink the entire enterprise and how we structure it and what we rely on when we advance science or research in the Arctic. Of course, co-production. Promoting co-production has been re-emphasized as an important trend or important task in the post-COVID Arctic science, right? It's decolonizing Arctic science, of course, has been a long-standing task, but now it's kind of opportunity to advance it further. Work to ensure that there is leadership of indigenous peoples in co-production and actually leads to improved science itself. We really have to remember that science that is done in isolation from indigenous knowledge is a bad science. And we really need to make sure that is reflected in our funding work and in our standards for publication and for scientific research as well. And of course, we need to emphasize the equitable engagement mechanism through redesigning, decolonizing, indigenizing science community relations. I think that's, again, was re-emphasized by the COVID pandemic. And invest in next generation, reflecting in how science in the future might be better trained and how they also versed into not only academic subject, not only in skills essential there, but also in context in which they work, which is, of course, very important. And yes, aggressively pursuing international collaboration. Again, and this, we have seen that that's the way to fix things when there are problems like with Mosaic, or when it's really an opportunity to join resources, so research coordination, funding synergies, and enforcement and implementation of Arctic Science Cooperation Agreement. So what are the key things? Well, it's a local shift in which we would, I guess, look at decolonizing Arctic science through localizing research enterprise, the elevating role of indigenous communities and local communities, investing in local science infrastructure, local connectivity, and human capital, exercising local first and using first as our priorities and funding, and pursuing community-driven and co-productive research. So resilient Arctic science will be based on a global coalition. And we really need all of us to coalesce across the countries, across disciplines, and across knowledge systems to meaningfully collaborate together, because otherwise we can't really advance Arctic science further in these new conditions. We also need to be bold. We need to be looking into future and build this coalition to maybe galvanize us for even more bold enterprises in the future, such as International Polar Year 2033, which is being discussed right now. So, and that would be a different year, not like the other ones that would actually embrace what I was just describing is its foundational concept. Then that would be a success, and we will build a more resilient Arctic science enterprise. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrey. We'll have some time to talk about your ideas a little bit later. Right now, I would like to invite Shari Fox to share her perspective.
Thanks. Thanks, Andrey. It's good to see you. It's been a while. I think that was a great lead into what I'm going to present, because I think Andrey presented a really good framework and a really good high-level look at this. And I'm going to take us right down to one community and look at what happened during COVID for the community and how it responded and how this links to research. So just very briefly, introduction, my name's Shari. I'm a researcher at the National Snow and Ice Data Center at the University of Colorado. I'm also the manager of the Ittaq Heritage and Research Center, which is located in Clyde River, Nunavut. I've been working and living in Clyde for about 20 years. I've been a remote scientist, able to live on Baffin full time until just recently, and I relocated to Alberta, but I spend half my time still in Nunavut. I'm gonna shut off my video and share my screen because I have some slides. Sorry. So hopefully you can see my slides. I'm going to start with just a little bit of context about COVID and Nunavut, because it did play out quite differently than a lot of the world and a lot of the Arctic. But just to familiarize people, Nunavut is here in northern Canada, and this is Baffin Island. And I'll be speaking about the community of Clyde River, which is here on the northeast coast. But what was a little bit different about COVID in Nunavut is it came quite late. So there were 0 cases in Nunavut for quite some time until November of 2020, when it first appeared in the community of Alkviat, and which I believe is the 3rd biggest community in Nunavut, and then a couple of smaller communities. Those cases eventually were cleared. Nunavut was back to 0, and that lasted for a while until 2 weeks ago when it finally arrived on Baffin Island in Iqaluit. This is the update of today. So right now there's 85 active cases in Nunavut. There have been 4 deaths, and you can see the other data of the different cases that they're following. So this has caused a territorial shutdown. Everyone is in lockdown right now. And just yesterday, the city of Iqaluit, where most of the cases, 81 out of the 85 are located, which is the capital of the territory, Iqaluit declared a state of emergency yesterday, which just allows them a lot more enforcing power. So I think it's important because a lot of the communities in Nunavut, including Clyde River that I'm going to talk about, haven't had COVID, but they're still dealing with the restrictions. And so in terms of research, there's been no research in Nunavut since last year. In Nunavut, you have to have a license to conduct research. So that's some of the way that the restrictions have been put in place. But we're going into the 2nd field season with no research being conducted in Nunavut. And I just wanted to share, there's been a lot of coverage about this, how research is being affected by COVID in the Arctic. So there's different articles that I just thought I'd throw up that bring up some issues. A lot of them Andrey touched on or are covered in his paper, but things like dealing with gaps in the data, how do we deal with that? I had to show this one. The future is vague but exciting. I like that headline. There's a lot of focus on the COVID data gap, and a lot of the response to that has been a lot of what Andrey talked about, which is investing in local communities to help fill those gaps, to be ready for when things like this happen. And we want to keep research moving forward for all of these important topics. So what kind of training, what kind of investments can we put into local communities? I mentioned that research is licensed in Nunavut. If you are interested in that at all, or how they've implemented COVID restrictions and dealt with researchers, you can visit their website. They have guidelines for research activities in Nunavut, and they keep that updated. And in Nunavut, in Canada, that's really how they've regulated research and what they've been allowed to go ahead or what they've held back. And it covers everything from ship-based to land-based research, travel considerations. And then what's really interesting is communities themselves have also made requests. I'll get to that in a bit here in a second. This isn't just the Arctic. All over the world, community-based research has been impacted. And there's been a lot of coverage again about all of this being an opportunity for scientists and communities to team up. In Canada, I've been working a lot on Guardians programs, Indigenous Guardians programs. I know in the US and Australia, they have these. So Indigenous communities and teams of guardians that are really involved in stewarding their lands. They do a lot of research and monitoring already. And in Canada, there's some really neat stories about how the Guardians programs have teamed up with scientists who would normally be in the field to get that work done during COVID. So I just want to quickly then flip back to tell you the story of how this played out in Clyde River, again, just to locate you. And I think what's really interesting is where, we heard from Andrey about the local turn. I feel like in Clyde River, we did that turn a long time ago. In 2005, we formed a research center called Ittaq. And since then, we've really been building a strong local research center and local research programs, skills. You can check us out on Facebook. And that really put us in an interesting position when COVID happened, because we could step in. Everything that we just heard, we were able to put into practice. And I want to show you some examples of that. I'm just going to take 1 minute. I feel it's really important to focus on the strengths that are already out there, the communities that are already doing these powerful things. That this isn't just an idea or proposal that we need to start thinking about as researchers or as funders, but there's communities that are already doing powerful stuff. Clyde River is one. I want you to watch this 1 minute video because I think it'll make an impact. This covers the research that we already do in the community. You're going to see physical science, social science. And I just messed it up. Hold on. Forgive me for that, everyone. Let me back it up because you need to hear the sound or it's just not as good.
Shari, we couldn't see the video. Oh, there we go. Okay, now we can see it.
I apologize. I just wanted to make sure you had the sound. So if you want to turn your sound on, it's much more impactful. But I just really feel this 1 minute is important. You're going to see different kinds of science and how the community does that. So I just really wanted to show that because there are these strengths already. We often talk about capacity building, and I feel like there's so much capacity already that just needs investment. And I'm going to talk about that in a second. So really quickly with COVID and having this center in the community, we as a community had to figure out, okay, well, first of all, how are we going to deal with COVID itself, but then how will we deal with all of the changes in research? And so everything in the community back in early 2020, when COVID was first announced, the territory went on lockdown. There was a lot of fear, as you know, in these tiny communities where we don't have medical resources. It's a fly-in only community. We have people with a lot of underlying health conditions, elders. So it was really scary. But what we were able to do is pivot the existing research capacity we had to just turn into like a COVID response center. And so these are some of the things that we immediately set out to in our community. So we prepared an emergency preparedness committee. We started writing letters right away, supporting our mayor and community leadership, asking for the supplies that the community wanted. We created a preparedness plan. We did mapping in the community, where are the vulnerable households, where are the assets? So people that had vehicles, people who had first aid training. We started jumping on the COVID funding that became available to start coordinating emergency funds. Food security was a huge issue because there was a time when the flights might have been shut down. So how do we keep people hunting and fishing and bringing food in? We needed to get information out to community members to make sure they knew what COVID was. We adapted existing programming that we had in the school at the wellness center. And so what was really interesting is I guess I had a little bit of a different experience with it, because on the one hand, all the outside research, all of the science-based stuff, they're really struggling. But in the community, it was like, that's where we thrived, because we were researchers and we put those skills to work on COVID to help the community. And so I think there's a broader message there of if we invest in communities for the climate change projects, the permafrost projects, the social science surveys, you're building those skills to let them flip it for when these kind of things happen. That was a really big lesson that we learned. And I'll just share a few photos. This was the school gym when the COVID food started coming in. So again, there was a lot of COVID relief in Canada and in Nunavut. So our staff pivoted to sort these things, get it all out to the households. We organized food breakfast programs. So normally kids have breakfast. Everybody had to stay home. So we went to work. This is our little research center here, by the way. It's a little house that we bought for $1, literally. But we had all the food shipped in and then did deliveries to homes instead of kids coming in. We had to pivot programming for people staying at home. There's a lot of overcrowded housing, a lot of kids that can't go to school. So how do you keep them busy during the day? Things that people everywhere had struggled with. So we had like make sunglasses contests and posted on Facebook, make your own fishing lures, make your own masks, decorate your windows. Anything we could do in the community to both provide information about COVID and keeping safe, but also just help people get through this really tough time where they're separated. One thing, we do a lot of land programming with our research, and we were able to convert that into hunting to make sure that we had that good food coming in. It's outside, so we didn't have to deal with a lot of the COVID restrictions. So that was a huge strength, being able to keep our land programming and hunting going to bring in food for people in the community. And like we've talked about, we were able to continue a lot of the research because we have, over the last decade and more, trained technicians in the community to run a lot of different projects we have independently. So this is our weather station network, and that we were able to do annual maintenance and everything. Normally we have people come in to help with that, but they're not necessary anymore. We've done 2 years now without them just fine. So another example of being able to stay independent. Andrey mentioned teaching the next generation. That's been a huge part of all of this, is the youth have been involved in everything that we've done. they're learning all these skills, and the whole idea is into the future. As these different events come up, they'll be able to do the same thing. So this is just my last couple points. Again, so we're going into the second research season with COVID restrictions. One of the things we were asked to reflect on was this idea of innovations, adaptation, and investment. For me, the first two, innovation and adaptation, I just think follow the local lead. Whenever we have these changes, whenever we're designing projects, the best way forward, at least in the community context, the regional, local context, it's following that local lead. Anytime you try to force it in another way or from outside, it never works. We've seen that fail time and time again. So the local lead and the design of these things is so important. Investments, Andrey hit on these too, that for real change, and coming from someone who's been co-managing a local research center for a long time, it's the big things that we struggle with. We can get project funding all over the place, but that's not sustainable. It's not what we really need. It's really investing in the capital things, in the physical capital, the infrastructure, and in the people, community researchers and students. I find it really interesting where there's this big call for like communities to be engaged, but to do that, you have to have those big things. You need a building, you need space, you need staff. Without that, it's really difficult to ask for communities to get so involved. So there has to be that equal investment, making sure it's long-term, making sure it's flexible, investing in things that already exist. Again, it's about identifying capacity and strengthening it versus capacity building, I think. I think too, with funding and investment is, making sure that how to apply for it and how to report on it fit with community as well. So this last quote is just from one of our community members who really focused on this idea of being strength-based in what we do, and whether that's research or community development versus deficit-based approaches. We've seen a lot of that in like vulnerability literature, or even in some of the discussions around resilient communities. We've been hearing some resistance around that now, just because it makes it seem like, again, there's some weakness in there somewhere. And it's not to say that communities don't have weaknesses, but I think we can really find these strength-based approaches, apply the skills broadly, and that means we can be strong for whatever changes we're facing. So whether that's from climate changes or when COVID comes along, those strengths are ready to go. And that's all I had.
Thank you so much, Shari. There is so much to learn from Ittaq. Thank you for sharing a little bit about what you've been doing during COVID. Roza, I'd like to invite you to share your perspective.
Thank you so much for the invitation. Hello to everybody. So, well, I would like to apologize that today I don't have any presentation. And I would like just to share my personal thoughts and also some kind of frustration also, if you agree with this, about things concerning fieldwork and doing fieldwork. You know, I'm now affiliated by University of Hamburg. I'm working together with many other institutions who are doing research for the Charter project. And Charter project is about climate change and all other things which are actually concerns about reindeer herding work and other things. So I would like just to send to the chat this link about our project, that you can just look to it and just to get more information. So it's in the chat window. So I'm actually working with people from the work package 3, and this work package 3 is called Socio-Economic Impact of Arctic Environmental Changes on Indigenous Populations and Local Communities. So my task is to travel to Siberia, Russia, and to talk to local people about many things which are connected to the reindeer herding work, about climate change, what kind of changes they see, also about all things which are connected to the reindeer herding work, which makes them profitable or just make extra difficulties. So I'm, as I mentioned, officially affiliated at the University of Hamburg, but also I'm deeply connected because of my studies and previous research also to University of Lapland in Finland. Therefore, I will tell you my personal narrative about my planning to do fieldwork. The thing is that I physically located in the Netherlands, and I'm working by distance at the University of Hamburg and also at the University of Lapland, and I need to do research in Siberia. So I need just somehow to connect myself in this global space. And in this perspective, I use a lot these benefits of internet and telephone connection, and also, of course, social media. In my previous talks, I think some of you were there. Andrey, I know that he participated in this meeting where I was talking about anthropology at home, where I just talked about all these pluses and minuses to do research among indigenous community when you are indigenous yourself, and what kind of pros and cons you can have being inside and outside at the same time. But now I realize that I'm do this anthropology at home in real time, not just doing research among indigenous communities, just doing research at home, but I'm just personally sitting physically at home on my table and just having some benefits like free coffee that you do not need to pay. It's a university cafe. So, and then I realized that after this 1 year of sitting at home, I need somehow to do research about how I can travel abroad. What kind of permissions universities have, different universities, in my case, University of Lapland and the University of Hamburg. So from the University of Hamburg, in the 1st of April, we got a letter that there are new rules about traveling abroad. And these rules said that we need strictly calculate all our costs and also time limits and all other things which were much easier before in previous days and years before COVID-19. But at the same time, when I was already prepared mentally to travel, because I discussed with our colleagues from our projects that I need to do my fieldwork already, and maybe I need just to plan meetings and with people there to preparing all these questionnaires and other things for the trip. Then I contacted the University of Hamburg saying that actually I would like to travel, but I need travel money and insurance for my trips. And then the letter said that it's not allowed. University doesn't permit me to travel. So there is no any money for my tickets and also insurance in official level. But if I would like to do my personal trip for myself, then I can allow to do this. But then I called to my colleagues and then we discussed all these things during our anthropology team meetings, saying that, okay, if it's allowed to travel just for private reason, what can I do with this? Then some people said, okay, you need to make a corona test and to get negative result for this in order to go to the plane. But then you need also to pay for this corona test. And of course, there is a time for quarantine when you need just to sit and wait for 2 weeks or 10 days in some countries. And in some cases, when you have this corona test paper, negative or positive, I don't know who has it. You need in Finland, for example, in Finnish language, pay €7. But if it's in English for traveling abroad, it costs much more. It's something like 250, if I'm not wrong. So, but then, okay, I'm ready to pay from my personal purse, pocket, this €7. But for traveling, to pay this amount of money plus tickets and also to use this data for my project later, I started just to think, do I need this actually? To pay all this money if project cannot pay for this at an official level. And also there are many restrictions among countries, who can travel and who cannot travel. In the Netherlands, you cannot travel abroad until 15th of May, but I do not know how these rules will change actually. So I'm waiting for this data. And also I know that officially Germany actually allowed to travel abroad for its citizens. But I'm working actually officially at the University of Hamburg. I should allow to travel, but still university doesn't let to travel. So there is this dilemma and somehow these things which have different things, rules, regulations, and instructions what to do and how to do. So I accepted this and decided to wait until I will be allowed to travel abroad officially, not paying for my tickets myself, not paying for corona test and also vaccination myself, but just to wait when it will be allowed, because without vaccination you cannot travel. But then to talk about this corona passport, which is necessary to have when you are traveling abroad in Europe, for example, from Europe to abroad and to return back. Some vaccines, they are not allowed, they are not recognized, for example, in your corona passport for coming inside of the country. And for example, if I will go to Russia, I will get, of course, for example, Russian Sputnik vaccine. But for coming back, this vaccine is not allowed. But Pfizer, for example, or other vaccines here, it's difficult to get in the Netherlands because these rules are actually said that first adults, I mean, these people of very senior age, they will get this vaccine first, but this process of vaccination is going slowly. And not all people, they have all these possibilities to get it. And then the only possibility I realized to do it is just to use these possibilities to do my field research from home, doing my anthropology at home. Just using social media, my old contacts, and also building new contacts with social media, Facebook, Contact, and other things. And also WhatsApp helps a lot. So I ask questions, the same questions what I can ask actually at home when I'm in Siberia, for example, about things which are happening, about weather, about things with reindeer, how reindeer herding work is going on, about cultivation seasons, and about food, reindeer food, about icing events. And of course, it's not the same. It's not the same because when you communicate with people for doing interviews and other things, you need a lot this personal contact. But yeah, in this case, we need to use all these possibilities which we have these days and just to wait maybe. Yes, that's all. Yeah, and I have more time just to sit and analyze all the things which I have collected before, like also today, just 1 hour ago, I finished our talk with dear Vitebsky about talking these fire signals and how to compare with coronavirus up in UK and what kind of things it could say and how to compare all these things from anthropological perspective. Yes, and also in chat I send this link to this lecture. if you would like to get more than just wait for an article. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rosa. I think all of the different contradictions you described and false starts and then arriving sort of back where you started at home and renegotiating how you're going to approach your project, that sounds probably very familiar to a lot of people. And thank you for sharing that experience. So last, but certainly not least, I'd like to invite Sveta to share her perspective with us. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Noor, for the invitation. And thank you to the fellow panelists. I feel that what I have to share just connects so nicely with what Andrey and Shari and Roza have shared thus far. So I'm a cultural anthropologist. I joined this panel from Fairbanks, Alaska, the indigenous homelands of the Northern Dene people of the lower Tanana River. And my adoptive homeland. I'm very grateful to have a home here and also to connect so much of my life and work with the indigenous homelands of the Chukchi, Nupiaq, and Siberian Yupik and Koyukon Dene people. So I for many years, my work has been on both sides of on Russian and Alaskan sides of the Bering Strait. I also work as an ethnographer in interior Alaska, here in along the road system, as well as in Middle Yukon River region communities. And so over the past year and quite some time prior to that, but especially during the pandemic year, my collaborators and I have been working through the practice of patchwork ethnography. And that patchwork ethnography, it's a methodological and theoretical approach. It's an emerging approach. It arises from the necessity to reconsider the divisions of this combination of home and field that Rosa, you so nicely outlined and exemplified, illustrated through personal experience. And I appreciate that very much. And it also resonated so much with what Andrey and Shari shared, is how they are positioned as researchers, but also people who are so connected with the communities where you do research. So, and actually just, I believe it was yesterday or the day before that the Anthropology, Journal of the Anthropology of North America has announced the launching of an online space that they call home/field, and it is really devoted to the questions that emerge in this context when anthropological field site is also your home, but also, we were here in a position to orient it towards the Arctic, where what we consider home, it varies and it can be an immediate local community, it can be your long time relationship, it can be the way that you're situated in your home region or as a researcher in the Arctic. Patchwork ethnography respects the use of fragmentary yet rigorous data. It widens the scope of acceptable materials and tools, and it employs the protocols and processes grounded in long-term commitments and contextual knowledge. So we with the technologies, with the communications between WhatsApp and Facebook and other social media and phone and email, even though the capabilities for this still vary widely and there's a lot of discrepancies in the Arctic, we are still in a lot better position to work with those tools than the pioneers of ethnographies were when they constructed these ideas of home and field and field work. So what this kind of approach can be benefited by is really the recognition of those tools and support for those tools by researchers based at universities and by researchers based in communities, and the collaborative relationships between and how those are used in the collaborative relationships between those. So For example, when Shari talked about her research and showing process and instrumentations and measurements and records, record keeping conducted by community-based researchers. And so in the case of ethnographic fieldwork, for example, right now over the past year in mid-March, when the communities where my husband and I have been long connected as researchers have gone, just like the rest of Alaska communities, most Alaska communities, into a lockdown, put travel ban, and then have very locally governed and dynamic approaches to mitigating risk and safety connected with COVID. And that we started discussing the approaches for documenting these experiences in real time, and then started doing this in the course of an Arctic Social Sciences program funded RAPID project. When I was just listening to Shari and looking through, looking at your slides and kind of reflecting on the very similar approach between that and, let's say, when either a community-based collaborator, when local resident with whom researcher also has long-time connection, for example, makes some kind of a Facebook post that says, okay, like we're right now in day 8 of the lockdown, tell us what you're doing to keep your family well. And then 30 or 50 or sometimes over 100 or more people respond to this post with stories and photos and various kinds of responses on what they're doing and what they're thinking about. That's also research, and that is also expertise and analysis and contextualization. And this is what patchwork ethnography emphasizes, that contextual knowledge of whether it is community-based researchers, a university-based researcher, or one that emerges in the course of a collaborative relationship between those. This contextual knowledge is crucial. A number of anthropologists, other social scientists who work through ethnography and storytelling emphasize that stories have a text, what is being said, the texture, how it is being told in the context, the reason, the context, the surroundings in which the story is being told. And inexperienced ethnographers alert to those. And so even in the instances of a short Facebook post, it is so much more than just information, right? It is, it warrants a discussion, it warrants a follow-up analysis, connecting by any means for further connecting analysis, contextualization. So patchwork ethnography makes in-person participant observation, when it's possible, all the more important, because it helps facilitate those relationships on which then these kinds of approaches can then rely. So actually, going back, Andrey, to what you noted, building community capacity to reduce the reliance on outside expertise. I would say it really should build on synergy and expanded opportunities for both. So, for example, for Igor Pasternak and I, from my husband and I, Alaska has been our adoptive homeland for over 20 years. And we have long-time commitments in our study communities. And for most of our lives, many of the young hunters and parents and leaders and community health aides whose everyday living and graduations and weddings and other family celebrations are being affected right now. We're trying to document and reflect on these experiences in real time. Funerals, of course, have also unfortunately been a part of this, and also being at UAF, University of Alaska Fairbanks, teaching and mentoring are also part of this patchwork, because so many students from different communities in Alaska are also students in our classroom. And during the pandemic year, they were also the ones impacted with their connection with their community, but also with things like the vaccine distribution, and including when the Grandma Virginia was the 93-year-old elder in Galena, Alaska, was the first person to receive the COVID vaccine. Her grandchildren were students at the same time, and this was part of both, celebration and discussion. I also mentor students from Chukotka who, alongside to having conducted field research, have continued working even prior to the pandemic through local field assistance, through, like Roza mentioned, WhatsApp. It's so those are the tools that need to be accepted and supported as not as a replacement for field work, but something that enhances it and broadens and brings in, has the capacity to bring in a variety of perspective alongside to long-time participant observation and in interviewing, and the relationship that make these shorter communications revelational and meaningful and powerful and also ethical. So that also, this is really just listening to Roza and thinking about our students. Yes, at University of Alaska Fairbanks, yeah, of course, there's greater number of students from communities around Alaska, but students go to all universities, and universities can also respond, those who have research in the Arctic, to with projects that also create opportunities, support this kind of capacity building. And at the same time, also recognizing that students who then could be tribal members or community members, but also live for their university studies somewhere else, and also then form the relationship somewhere else, fall in love somewhere else, establish life somewhere else, but continue to be connected to their community, also make this home and field and insider expert and outsider expert somewhat of a fuzzy dichotomy. So moving forward, that I really want to thank the organizers of the current panel, as well as everyone in the research community who is really interested in this conversation. I think we're at a really good learning moment, and I'm really glad that we're connecting like this, alongside to continuing to being connected in our research communities.
Thank you so much, Sveta. Thank you to all of the panelists. I think you've given us a lot of both practical and theoretical tools to think with and to plan with. And I really appreciate the perspectives you shared. I found them to be really complementary. What we're going to do now is take a few questions from participants, from those who might have something to ask of the panelists. And then we'll have a short break, and then we'll be coming back together in breakout groups. And I hope that we can carry some of these ideas that the panel has brought to us into those discussions. So if anyone has a question, please post it in the chat. And I apologize, we won't have a lot of time to discuss right now questions in plenary, because we want to make sure there's time for those small breakout groups.